I'm Justin. Eric is here. He's the floating orange dot, and hey, he's moving again.
I did it.
Yeah, we're Sonic Bloom, co-founders of Sonic Bloom. Every week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Twitch, we cover like the latest game industry news or topics that we think we can talk about and give an industry perspective from. So, first topic of conversation is kind of a neat one. Ratchet and Clank recently got a PS5 patch that brought it up to 60 frames per second. It was running at 30 frames per second on the PS4. It's of note because the method that they used to patch was different than usually what you see in a game. Usually, what you'll have is a game developer will take their game, make alterations in the code by changing lines or whatever else to increase frame rate, stability checks or fixes, whatever. It's a bunch of code that goes in, gets submitted, and the software, as it's running on the hardware, will say this is the version that you should be running from, and we'll be running all all the latest code. Ratchet and Clank, however, took a totally different approach. Basically, they rolled back. They rolled back to a prior version of the software that either had a frame unlock or was more easily unlocked, but it now runs at 60 frames per second on an older version of the firmware available for the game itself. So it has some interesting implications. Eric, do you want to elaborate at all about the patch process and any insight you might be able to lend there?
It's a little odd for one because of the back out, and I'm not sure how many of the details we have. It's a full. Is it a full blown, like we just literally took patch number 1.2 and to patch 1.6 to jump over 1.5?
No, it's actually more direct than that. So like someone did a deep dive on the software to see what was going on, and basically they were determining that as the PS5 would take the disc in, it would determine an older revision of the disc. Or not this, but of the firmware to run instead of the latest one. It may have required a patch to do it. They're like, hey, by the way, go back to this one. But either way, it's running like a many-year-old version of the software.
So you said firmware. Did you mean you didn't mean the PlayStation firmware, right? You meant
the
game software.
The game software, yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. My concern with that approach is that what in the updates from that old version to the newest ones?
I assume there was a frame rate lockout to get stability,
yes.
and they said it's locked, right?
Right. If that's the only thing that changed, awesome. If there were gameplay fixes, that's the risk that I'm concerned about. Is if it's totally fine to roll back an update if you need something, but the question is, what do you potentially lose? And game updates are usually very, very lax on details, unless it's a massively multiplayer game where all of your gameplay is going to very particularly impacted by that. Like Blizzard games have updates that have very detailed change logs, because you need to know that your main that you play on Overwatch had their ability nerfed in some certain way in some aspect.
Right.
But a game like Ratchet and Clank and most Sony games, usually it's and that's it. And they'll sometimes there's notable changes that like the gaming population will pick up on and say like, oh, the latest patch did this, and that becomes sometimes newsworthy, and even though it wasn't listed. In this case, we don't know what did or didn't change, or if they were like, so it's interesting that they decide, well, we locked the frame in order to improve performance, reliability, and the PS4 generation. That ends up being a detriment in the PS5 when we have tons of overhead. So we'll just let it and let the PS5 do what it does best.
Yeah, I think there's some caveats here. A handful, the caveats I think mostly are that Ratchet and Clank's a single player game, right? So the type of likely to get are likely to be stability improvements or performance improvements that help the game run better. But now we're talking about a piece of hardware that doubles or more than doubles the capability of the CPU and GPU, if not at very least on the clock rates. So they were actually probably able to look at it and say, okay, the last year or 2 years of patches only made it more stable for the set of hardware it was on, but we can roll back to whatever it was that they rolled back to, and it wasn't going to have a detrimental effect. Versus like maybe like an online multiplayer game where if you were to do that, you'd probably lose functionality and also cause conflicts that would just make it untenable in that situation. So we're probably looking at something that's very specifically limited to single player offline campaign style games. Yeah. Cool. Let's move on to the third topic, third piece of news, which is kind of a deep topic, but I'm sure people might have realized that graphics cards, especially the new RTX cards and AMD's offering, I think it's the XT series, and PS5s and Xboxes are and this is all largely due to
no way.
Yeah, right. And especially with the graphics cards are it's way more brutal than the PS5 was, and this has been going on nearly the same amount of time. So, but yeah, there's but either way, there's a silicon shortage, and it's like the roots of it are basically that as of 2020, people had had placed their orders and whatnot for their needs, and typically these parts are ordered ahead of time and produced ahead of time. Then, if everybody's unclear of what happened in the past year, there was a global pandemic that made it difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
No way. It made it very difficult for people to manufacture the type of components because you couldn't put people close to each other. Safety protocols had to be followed. And as of right now, there's a 10 to 20% reduction in overall output in most factories, especially these sort of small components that go into silicon boards. So if there's a 10 to 20% reduction, then you look at like what's happened this year as far as what's been released. So we've had 2 new graphics card generations been released that had significant improvements and had a lot of hype about them. We've had 2 new consoles released, and then there's just widely a larger demand for all of these things because people have been stuck indoors. All of this has resulted in a 20 to 30% increase in demand on the manufacturers. So there's like a 30 to 40% gap in what is demanded and what is actually being produced at these factories.
Yeah, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but the games industry had a gangbuster year last year in hardware sales and software sales and everything sales.
So that's one news. Yeah. The other side of it is, well, I guess I kind of talked about both, which is like the lag in production to the time in place is you have this component manufacturing happens months before final assembly happens, which happens before it actually gets shipped out, which takes usually months because of you produce something in China or Taiwan, that has to get shipped over to final assembly, usually in China. And then final assembly goes onto boats. Boats take a month or so to actually get into port. Then it gets to distribution from port. And so you're seeing like this multi-month lag from the time you actually go from we need new components to the time it actually makes it in hardware. And that's one of the things that are causing some of the additional drag on this whole thing.
This one. Go ahead.
I'll let you kick it out. You know what I'm going to say.
Yeah. So speaks mostly to the graphics card. When Justin earlier mentioned that especially graphics cards are hard hit right now, and it is in part due to the fact that it's not. I mean, you have scalpers on the console as well, because there is potential there. The demand is much higher than the supply, and therefore you can get people who will be willing to pay over MSRP for it. The same holds true with graphics cards. The problem is the demand is even higher because the graphics cards serve 2 markets. They serve the game players, or at least high-end graphics cards, game players, and the AI slash what's it the Bitcoin mining, the digital currency mining groups benefit drastically from the technology in those chips. And even though some of the chip manufacturers like Nvidia sometimes try to lock out that type of use case for some of the chips, people have found workarounds that allow it to work. And that drives up the demand because you can throw a couple of those in and make more money faster that way. Like literally make the money. That is, you know, driving extra demand. People are willing to pay more because they're going to actually make money with it. And so you have these two markets that are both vying for it, and now the prices for GPUs are huge. They're much higher than their MSRP.
Yeah, no, it's been lousy for like genuine gamers that have been trying to get a hold of stuff. It's been difficult, especially, and yeah, I mean, like, and everybody's stuck at home, which makes it even worse because you're like, oh, I'd love to be able to play, Cyberpunk at a reasonable frame rate, and you're waiting on a 3080 to do it, and it's just it's almost impossible to get one.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to take this week to talk about sort of like we've talked about this before, the future of game audio, but when we last talked about it, it was kind of wistful, and like, what were the things that we'd like to see change about the way game audio is done now, and how we would love to see advancements happen. This one's actually taking a look at the game audio techniques that we know exist, and how those might be affecting games tomorrow. And you don't have to look very far to find what people are working with. The Unreal 5 demo sort of talked about 3 core things, which were the spatialized rendering, or ambisonics, which is an old tech, and then convolution reverb that they're pretty jazzed about, and how that sort of plays into things. And then you had Sony talking about HRTFs with the Tempest engine and how that's going to work into how we experience audio in games. So I just wanted to go over these and talk about what are those technologies exactly? How are they used? How might they be used in the future and future games? What do they sort of contribute to the overall experience? And what can we maybe expect? I guess is where we can by the time we wrap up. So, are there any of those, Eric, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think what's interesting we can do HRT. I'll jump into HRTFs a bit.
Okay.
Which are, the idea there is an HRTF is I believe it's a head rotational transform function, or transform frequency. I think it's function. At any rate, what it refers to is, a mathematical representation, effectively, the mathematical representation of the shape of your ears. Because effectively your ears are doing digital signal processing on audio that hits the side of your head. And the reason that it's useful and interesting is because the way that those modulate the sound that's coming in, depending on if it's coming in front of you or behind you or up into the sides, you can determine where the sound is coming from, in part because of how your ears adjust those sounds, and by the time it hits your eardrums and reverberates inside of your eardrums, it's been modulated by the shape of your ears. So for audio that's coming through your headphones, it's just flat. Everybody gets the same audio, and it's literally just these 2 points that come at you. If, on the other hand, you're able to somehow model someone's ear, the changes that the transform that the ear would cause to happen just naturally on sound, then you could pre-process the audio that's coming in from these 2 directions just fixed, so that it sounded like it was actually coming from up here, so that it had the same transform when it left the speaker position, to make it sound like it was from up into the side. And positional audio in the PS5, if you have your headphones on, you can apply the HRTF, and the sound, if it's coming over here, will be applied with that transform, so that you can actually hear as though it's coming from off into the side. So this type of approach is going to be pretty phenomenal for providing positional experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it should do a better job of helping your brain make sense of, especially with like lateral movement of
Yeah.
objects, because your ears, yeah, they play an important part in the way you perceive how sound comes in, and so picking the right profile may actually help you better differentiate sound that sounds like it's coming from above you versus below you versus behind you, etc. Um, and I actually, a larger point to all the things that we're likely to talk about is this is now being made possible not because it's a technology that was developed like yesterday. It's been around for quite a long time. HRTFs have been known for quite some time, but it's because the transformations you have to do on the audio as it comes to the system is quite expensive, and especially during the PS4 generation, they didn't afford the budget in the CPU to actually do that. You'd have to eat through some of your overhead that would usually be going to game logic or graphics rendering and give it to the audio system. And
Yeah.
developers didn't
And as we
want
know,
that.
right, as we know, most game developers prioritize graphics over audio.
Right. So with the Tempest engine having a dedicated piece of hardware that's meant specifically to do fast calculations of these transform functions, now we're actually seeing a future in which games should be able to implement interesting new transform functions to audio, but the system itself can be processing things and spitting it out in a way that helps you better spatialize the audio that's incoming on just standard two speaker headphones. Yeah, we can talk a bit about ambisonics and spatialized rendering. Again, this is not a new technology. This is a technology that's been around for quite a long time, has been implemented in different methods in different ways. And I think there's two core changes that have made this more special for this generation. And I guess like the definition of ambisonics is I mean, basically it's spatialized audio, how audio sounds in a 3D environment, and how that sound changes as it moves across like a listener. In the case of people, we have 2 ears, we have 2 listeners. So if an object travels from one end of the screen to another, you would have sound to both ears, and as it transfers over, you're going to have it coming into both, and then slightly one's going to get quieter and the other one's going to sound louder. But it's like the way that we sort of perceive sound. Before it has been applied in pretty, I'd say, rudimentary ways. Like we know that some things in the spatial environment, but the way that we would do transform functions on the audio wasn't particularly advanced. So
the volume is out of the left channel as it transmits to the right channel, and then raise the volume on the right channel.
Yeah, it's not particularly effective.
No, it really isn't.
So now we're looking at a case where newer recording techniques are really helping this, and that's using binaural recording, which is to have 2 microphones, each one acting as an ear, in a lot of cases taped to a head to get the type of acoustic environment. So in a lot of cases, you can take a recording that has like, say, like a bird flapping overhead and going over you and going like, okay, let's analyze how that audio came through, how it transferred across 2 headphones that are strapped to a head, and then process that, turn that into an algorithm that would transform the audio in game time and have that be reproduced on your head. So now we're getting a sort of an application of it that sounds far more convincing. And again, like, go ahead.
Did you mention binaural there?
Yeah, binaural recording and listening. Like, well, binaural listeners. Yeah.
But right, yeah. So yeah, there are actually 2 separate, like ambisonic recording and binaural recording are 2 separate concepts.
They are, but binaural recording contributes to ambisonics, in which you get more convincing ambisonics from a binaural recording that you can record, analyze, and reproduce.
Insofar as you have 2 listeners on the endpoint or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about binaural versus ambisonics is binaural works through headphones. It does not work through speakers, like for playback. However, ambisonics works through speakers, and ambisonics typically requires 4 speakers, and then it can be expanded to more, except that the decoding process of an ambisonic encoded sound changes depending on the number of speakers that you have. So this is once again part of the reason why it wasn't really commonly done before, because all of this, the binaural recording or playback and the ambisonic playback, require more processing. And
Yeah, I'd also like to say that these are made possible now, and this is like just what we just said before, is that like these are just realistically, these are just fancy DSPs, right? It's a way of like processing the outgoing audio signal and going like, how is it that this is going to be reproduced on the output? And the more and more complex it gets, the more and more transform functions you have to do. The more complex the transform functions are, and the reason why this is more or less available today, and especially with this new generation, is that there was a focus on having dedicated hardware that is purpose built to do these expensive math calculations on audio, so that when it gets reproduced, you get things like ambisonics that are more accurate and better transform across ear to ear as it travels through space. And then on top of that, adding HRTF functions on top of the ambisonic audio to even give it like more detailed expression in 3D space.
yeah,
So yeah, that's kind of like the reason why we're seeing these changes now. Do you want to cover the last point? Well, it's not the last point. We'll talk about a broader one that covers all of these. But do you want to talk about like convolution reverb?
why don't you introduce the topic?
Okay. Convolution reverb is something that we've heard Unreal talk about. They were in their Unreal 5 demo. They were talking about it quite a bit, specifically because they're like, hey, we have again recording techniques that we're able to then reproduce these convolution reverb transform functions onto audio. So like, what exactly were they talking about? What does it all mean? I can go into it basically again.
Sure.
With binaural recordings, you can better listen to the way audio travels through a space. So it's not just audio traveling past your head, but it's when audio audio is propagated through air, and say it's in a an opera theater, or it's in a subway, you're going to have the waves propagate off the walls, bounce and reflect, and then smash into each other, cancel out. And if you have soft objects, if you have even the walls of a tunnel themselves are going to absorb a certain amount of the frequency of the audio that's coming. It's being propagated through, and you're going to get like I don't know, like lows getting muted or highs being muted. This is all stuff that we hear naturally. We don't think twice about, but when we hear it reproduced artificially, we're quite good at saying like, this doesn't quite sound like a cave.
Yeah.
So now with modern recording that we just talked about, this binaural recording, you have two probes that are listening to a space and listening to how audio is being reflected and absorbed in a given space. And convolution reverb is essentially the measurement and reproduction of that. It's all nuanced aspects of the way audio propagates through a physical space, and listening to what these changes to the audio are, and then comparing it to what was admitted to what was heard, and then reproducing via DSP to reproduce a sound that is very convincingly being reflected and absorbed in a given space. I think the point is now is that with today's hardware, it being what it is, and both Sony and Microsoft dedicating the hardware in the boxes themselves to actually doing this sort of audio processing, now we're going to get like a lot more convincing, models